られないでも諦めない牙と拳握りしめてこの運命と明日の記憶いつ砕いて守るよ
The clock read exactly 11 as Mimiko turned on her computer. For once that week, she was on time. Her fingers skimmed across the keyboard as she typed in her password, then waited for the machine to log her into the system. Last night had been rather uneventful, once things had settled down. She didn't remember dreaming, though she didn't feel any more rested than she had yesterday. But at least she'd had breakfast, even if it had only been a little granola. Jiro hadn't been awake to protest. The voices of her fellow compromisers fell all around her as they came and left the office for their various assignments. She was diligently typing in a report when Hibari suddenly put her hands over her fellow compromiser's eyes.
Guess who?
Mimiko tried to impatiently pry the hands from her face.
Hibari, stop it! I'm not in the mood for guessing games.
Her junior let go and placed both hands on her hips.
Mimiko, you're such a sour grape. Can't you lighten up for once? Honestly.
In case you hadn't noticed, I'm trying to work here.
The compromiser did her best to try and ignore the energetic girl, continuing to type around Hibari's attempts to get her attention.
Where'd you go last night? I mean, really? You just up and disappeared. And there was a really cute Blackblood who came asking for you. Not that he's better looking than the Silverblade, but you could always have used the opportunity to make him jealous.
Mimiko looked up in surprise, momentarily forgetting about her report.
What vampire?
Hibari flipped an errant strand of hair to one side.
That's what I was trying to tell you. He was incredibly handsome. Almost as handsome as a Silverblade. I almost fainted wondering if he was going to ask me if he could suck my blood.
The younger girl pretended to swoon, overdoing it and almost fell to the floor. Mimiko tried to ignore her theatrics, though it wasn't easy. She pushed Hibari away from her keyboard, not sure if she'd managed to hit a few keys in the process of pretending to faint or not.
What did he want?
He wanted to see you, obviously.
Mimiko tapped an impatient finger. Sometimes getting information out of the chatterbox was a very delicate process, especially when the girl thought she had some very valuable information that the other party really wanted.
Did he leave a name?
Hibari had to think for a moment, one finger on her chin as she looked briefly up at the ceiling.
No, not really. He just asked if you were here and left when we couldn't find you.
He just left. Uh-huh, right. Are you sure you're not making this up?
She gave her junior a disbelieving look. Her thoughts were written clearly on her face.
Honest, Mimiko, I'm not making it up. That's all he really said, and he didn't leave a name or anything. He just wanted to know if you were here. He did seem a bit weird, though.
Hibari quickly did her best to reassure her friend.
What do you mean? How was he weird?
Mimiko glanced quickly at her face, her expression intense, though she couldn't say why it seemed to matter so much.
Well, he seemed a little nervous now that I think about it. Anxious about something. Maybe he was in a hurry.
She glanced at her watch, as if speaking about time had reminded her of something.
Oh no, look at the time. I've got to go. We'll have to catch up later.
She quickly ran out of the room without a second glance. Mimiko rubbed at one temple.
Honestly, what was that all about? And what vampire would be looking for me?
She decided Hibari had been making it up after all and quickly forgot about it. The afternoon was wearing on as Jiro inspected the welding around the back door. He even used the hide hand against it, just enough to know it hadn't been tampered with since it had been resealed. Finally satisfied, he stood from his crouch and headed back to the front of the building. He could already hear Kotaro's voice from out front, bubbly as usual, as Rensuke brought him home from Sei's house. The purple-haired human would probably want to talk. He sighed, knowing that it was inevitable as he stepped around the corner.
Welcome back, Kotaro.
He smiled as he opened the door for them. The young vampire launched himself at his older brother, a smile plastered across his face. The giant teddy bear he'd nicknamed Lord Bow Wow was strapped to his back like a school bag.
Brother, you wouldn't believe how much fun I had!
Not needing an invitation, he proceeded to go into detail about the various activities and games they'd shared. Rensuke, a criminal investigator from the Order Coffin Company, waved lightly as he watched the slightly surprised Silverblade detach his younger brother so that they could go inside.
Long time, Jiro darling.
He walked behind them, entering without permission.
Kane asked me to give you his regards.
Jiro didn't so much as turn around, but used the hide hand to close the door behind everyone, with perhaps a bit more force than was necessary. Kane Warlock was another Black Blood, one of the leaders inside the Special Zone. Rensuke knew Jiro didn't get along with that vampire, but couldn't resist teasing him about it.
Is that so?
He didn't so much as break his stride, keeping his face neutral, even though part of him really enjoyed the fact that Rensuke had jumped when the door closed. The investigator had to trot to keep up with the Black Blood and his brother. Kotaro rushed ahead of them all on his way to put his large bear away.
Jiro,
The investigator stopped halfway up the stairs.
Can we talk for a moment?
Jiro stopped and looked back, noting that his friend wasn't smiling now. In fact, his face was uncharacteristically serious. He took a step down and raised his eyebrows in question. Rinsuke fidgeted a little. Kotaro's happy chirping could be heard in the silence as he zoomed around the upper level of the apartment.
There's something you should know about, but I don't think Kotaro should hear about this.
Jiro folded his arms, his expression unreadable.
I'm listening.
Rinsuke tugged uncomfortably at his collar, silently asking himself once more why he'd been the one selected to pass on this bit of news.
Well, you see, it has to do with Mimiko.
Jiro was almost instantly in his face growling.
What about Mimiko?
He'd noticed something was off, though he hadn't had a real chance to ask about it, aside from what they discussed the night before. And with the attempted break-in the other night, he was more than ready to think the worst. The purple-haired man tried to take a step back, but couldn't.
Jiro, darling, you're standing on my foot. Could you?
Jiro took a step back, Rinsuke wincing slightly as he let out a sigh of relief.
Thank you.
Now, what about Mimiko?
The investigator tried to clear his throat as he stared into the vampire's eyes. He blinked quickly in case Jiro tried to irate the information out of him. The last time that had happened, he'd passed out and come to with a vile headache. It was an experience he didn't want to repeat anytime soon.
It's just that, well...
Out with it, Rinsuke! Before I lose my patience!
The purple-haired man leaned against the stair railing for support, feeling more than a little intimidated by the cold stare.
Well, Jedi asked me to pass on that some strange black blood was asking about her at the office. I guess she'd already left for the day when he showed up. Jedi's worried, though, because this guy was acting very nervously for some reason. At least that's what I'm told.
He put his hands up in defense as Jiro's expression darkened.
No one seems to know anything about him. At least, no one's able to accurately describe him. The testimonies are all mixed up, but Jedi thought you should know. He's not well sure what to make of it himself, and as he did ask you to look after her, well, you know how it goes.
He tried to shrug casually. Jiro ground his teeth, fangs protruding.
Does Mimiko know about this?
I don't think so. At least, they were all asked not to mention it, though some of them do have rather big mouths.
Brother!
Both vampire and human turned to look as Kotaro called down from the top of the stairs.
I'm hungry. When's Mimi coming home?
The young vampire's eyes were large as he took in how close the two men were to each other, not to mention his brother's stance. Jiro immediately made himself relax and smile.
I'm sure she'll be home very soon. But remember, she does work later now.
Oh, right. I forgot. Do you think she'd mind if I help myself to something in the kitchen?
Jiro looked back towards Rinsuke, who shrugged. The Black Blood knew the compromiser better than he did.
I don't think that's a good idea. You should wait.
Kotaro's face fell as his stomach rumbled.
But I'm really, really hungry.
Jiro sighed, rubbing near the bridge of his nose.
Can't you just be a little bit more patient?
Rinsuke put his hands up as the Black Blood looked back to him for some help.
Don't look at me. I've done all I came to do. I really should be getting back now. Just don't do anything reckless. We don't know what he wants, and I don't think Jedi wants her to know. At least not for now.
Brother!
Kotaro called again, distracting the older vampire long enough for Rinsuke to slip back down the stairs and out the door. Jiro's shoulders sagged.
Alright. I'll order something. But you better be extra nice to Mimiko when she gets home. She'll have had a long day.
Okay.
Kotaro zoomed out of sight, leaving Jiro to ponder what Rinsuke had told him. Mimiko let out a sigh of relief as she finally reached home. As if the day hadn't been long enough, one of her superiors, thankfully not Janai, had called her in on some errors she'd made in one of her reports. It had taken what felt like forever to fix. She slumped into the apartment, wondering what she could possibly make for dinner. No doubt everyone would be hungry. But there really wasn't much food in the house. She'd forgotten to go grocery shopping earlier. She paused as she took off her shoes at the top of the stairs and sniffed the air. Was that teriyaki? She let her tired senses drift with the aroma for about 5 seconds, then stopped abruptly. She could hear Kotaro's voice from the kitchen. Was Kotaro trying to cook something? Thoughts of the worst kind filled her head as she anticipated not having a kitchen because of his overeager assistants. She dashed for the room in question, only to stop in surprise in the doorway.
Ah, Mimiko. Welcome home.
Jiro's cheerful greeting caused her to relax a little. Kotaro wasn't alone. The boy jumped up from the table and threw himself at her, wrapping his arms around her.
Mimi's home, and just in time for dinner, too.
The girl froze in surprise as Kotaro pounced, giving her a big hug. She was glad he wasn't any shorter, or he'd have knocked right into her still-hurting knee. She looked up at Jiro, who merely shrugged.
Kotaro couldn't wait and wanted us to order something. I didn't believe you would be too appreciative if he tore the kitchen apart to satisfy himself.
Mimiko shuddered at the thought, taking a quick look around to make sure everything was still in order. It was, though the trash seemed more full than it had been when she'd left that morning. Noticing the direction of her stare, Jiro smiled a bit wryly.
We actually had them delivered twice.
Her shoulders sagged as she noticed the takeout containers, not sure if she felt relieved or defeated.
Oh, I'm such a terrible housekeeper.
Kotaro pulled away and returned to his seat, brandishing his chopsticks.
It's really good. You should try some.
Thanks.
Avoiding the table legs as best she could, she moved to sit down. She winced a bit as her knee was jarred, but didn't let out a sound of complaint, knowing Jiro would say something. He passed her a pair of chopsticks.
How's your knee tonight? Does it feel better?
She put on a faint smile.
Oh, you know, good as new unless I bang into something.
Jiro leaned forward slightly from his place across from her.
Would you like me to look at it again?
She clenched a fist under the table. She knew he was only trying to show his concern, but she didn't want him fawning over her right now.
No, that won't be necessary. It'll go away in a few days anyway. There's nothing to worry about.
He let it drop, and they ate in silence for several minutes. Kotaro started chattering happily about his day. The sound of his voice fell into the background of both the Silver Blade and the compromiser's thoughts. Mimiko began picking at her food, moving the noodles around in the carton with her chopsticks. Jiro watched, wondering if she'd been eating lately. It didn't look like she had, but he wasn't about to bring it up in front of his brother. Kotaro stuck his chopsticks in his empty container.
Ah, that was good.
He looked around at the two adults still picking at their noodles.
Can I be excused?
Mimiko turned to him with a smile.
Of course. Why don't you go play with your bear for a while?
All right.
The boy jumped up again and zoomed towards the room he shared with Jiro, arms spread out like he was an airplane. Mimiko put her chopsticks down.
Where does he get all that energy? And so late in the day.
She ran an errant hand through her hair.
Oh well, at least I have a chance to catch up on sleep tomorrow.
Jiro stood and began clearing the table while she fidgeted.
Another long day.
He picked up her discarded container while she rubbed at her temples.
You could say that. I got called in on a mistake I'd made in my paperwork. Of course, it could have really been Hibari's fault. She always likes to hover, making my work more difficult. It took forever to fix. If only the supervisor had listened. I think I need a vacation.
Jiro swept the last few crumbs into his gloved hands.
I can always ask Jinai for you.
It's fine. Tomorrow's the day off anyway, unless I get called in on something, which isn't likely. Besides, with the potential of being called in to mediate, I doubt I'd get the time. Not until they figure out what's going on, that is. Maybe I should just call it a night.
Jiro watched her as she headed to her room, probably to change out of her work uniform. He wondered if she'd heard about the vampire Rinsuke had mentioned. He couldn't bring up the subject without going against Janai's wishes. Janai was, after all, very protective about the girl, almost as protective as he was. The sound of the shower brought him out of his reverie. She would probably take her time now. And he couldn't blame her. No one liked to be bawled out by a superior, no matter what the reason. He just hoped that was the only reason she felt the need to de-stress tonight. She hadn't eaten much. He'd have to talk to her about that. Mimiko let the water run as she closed her eyes and turned her face into the warm stream. She'd come so close to confiding in him what Hibari had told her earlier that day. She wasn't entirely sure why she hadn't, or why she didn't feel like doing so either. Maybe she just didn't want Jiro to worry needlessly. After all, no one knew why the strange black blood wanted to see her. For all she knew, he was someone she'd helped and he wanted to thank her. Not as likely, but possible. She put one hand against the wall. At least she'd have the opportunity to sleep in as long as she wanted, to forget that she'd ever heard anything about it. She'd just pretend nothing had happened and go on as usual. She opened her eyes, looking down at her purple knee. It didn't hurt as much today. Well, not in the usual way, but it did ache. She wasn't sure if the hot water was making it ache more or if it was helping. But it was obvious that the purple had spread. She wouldn't be able to hide it with her skirt if it spread any further, something she knew would make Jiro worry. But it was just a bruise, albeit a good one. She sighed. There were worse things he could worry about. She turned the water off and reached for her robe, wrapping it around her slight frame. The warm water had made her drowsy, but she had to make it back to her room before she let herself drift off, preferably changing into pajamas before then. Not sure where Jiro was, mainly because he was usually just so quiet, she made a quick dash to her room, trusting that he was trying to keep Kotaro occupied while she de-stressed. She was in luck and made it safely to her room, where she quickly dried off and put on a comfortable pair of sweats. In minutes, she was fast asleep under the covers. Jiro listened to the sound of Mimiko's breathing as he stared out into the night. It was well past midnight now. Supposedly, in a few weeks, their schedules would sync and he would officially become her closer, the one who made sure everything went well in mediation, which generally meant keeping the compromiser safe and out of trouble. And from what he could tell, Mimiko really needed one. He had a lot of words for her about taking better care of herself. It was true that since the battle with Kasa and the Kowloon children, Janai had tried to keep Mimiko out of the thick of things, something he felt he owed him for. But he knew it wouldn't last forever. And now, with this strange vampire looking for her, he didn't know what to think. He'd have to keep a closer eye, he decided, and match his sleeping schedule more to hers until hers became more like his, something both he and Janai hoped for. Perhaps, however, Mimiko's humanness would win in the end, and Jiro would simply sync with her for however long he had left with her. He listened for any sound that might mean trouble, but the streets were quiet. He could hear Mimiko tossing and turning in her sleep, and found himself wondering what thoughts plagued her dreams.